pale blush crept across the horizon, gentle as a secret, as the first light of morning unfurled its delicate fingers over the quiet coastal town of Westmere. Here, at the very edge of the English countryside, the world seemed to hold its breath, suspended between sea and sky. The cliffs, rugged and ancient, stood like silent sentinels above the restless tide below, their faces streaked with emerald moss and wildflowers that clung bravely to every crevice. The air was rich with the mingled scents of salt, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle, a fragrance that spoke of memory, of longing and of hope. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their calls rising and falling on the breeze, while the sleepy cottages of the village nestled in the gentle embrace of the hills, smoke curling from their chimneys in lazy ribbons. In the heart of this serene tableau stood Wren Manor, a modest estate perched on the highest point of the cliffs, its windows catching the first golden rays of dawn. The manor's stones were weathered by years of wind and rain, softened at the edges, much like the man who now called it home once more. Alistair Wren stood at the window of his study, hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette etched against the pale light. His return to Westmere had been quiet, almost secretive, and the house felt transformed by his presence, though not in the way he might have hoped. The corridors, once alive with laughter and the footfalls of family, now echoed with an emptiness that pressed in around him. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning sun, drifting lazily, as if reluctant to settle. Alistair's eyes, a cool grey that had once sparkled with cleverness and anticipation, now lingered on the horizon with a faraway ache. The years abroad had marked him deeply. There was a tiredness in the set of his shoulders, a heaviness in the way he moved. He wore his solitude as one might wear an old coat, familiar, protective, and yet threadbare at the seams. The loss that had driven him to distant shores had not been left behind. It had travelled with him, silent and persistent, and he found it waiting for him in every quiet room, every familiar view. He turned from the window, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet, and let his gaze wander over the study. The shelves lined with books whose spines had faded in the sun, the desk cluttered with unopened letters and half-formed thoughts, the armchair where his father once read aloud on stormy evenings, all whispered of things gone, things missed. Alistair pressed his palm to the cool glass of the window, as if trying to anchor himself in the present, to remind himself that he was truly home. Down in the village the day began in earnest. The market square awoke with the chime of church bells, and the low murmur of neighbours exchanging greetings. Among them moved Maeve Callahan, her steps sure and light, a basket looped over her arm and her auburn hair tucked neatly beneath a faded blue scarf. She had lived in Westmere all her life, her roots entwined with those of the ancient oaks in the fields beyond. Maeve's eyes, the colour of moss after rain, held a quiet resilience, a steadiness that came from weathering her own share of storms. She paused by the baker's stall, exchanging a warm smile with old Mr. Fennel, and purchased a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. The aroma mingled with the fresh morning air, comforting and familiar. Maeve's hands, nimble and capable, cradled the bread as she made her way along the cobbled streets, past the tailor's shop and the ivy-clad church, toward the path that wound up to Wren Manor. Each step along this path was a step into her past and her future. She could not remember a time when the manor was not part of her life's landscape. Maeve had begun working at the manor as a young girl, following in her mother's footsteps. The house had always seemed a world apart, grander, quieter, touched by a kind of sadness she'd only begun to understand as she grew older. Yet she had found comfort in its rituals, in the simple acts of care and order. Over time she had become more than just a maid. She was a keeper of stories, a witness to the small joys and silent griefs that marked the passage of years. Today, as she climbed the final rise, her heart fluttered with a blend of anticipation and uncertainty. Alistair's return had been the subject of much conversation in the village, whispered about over cups of tea and at the edges of church pews. Some spoke of him with admiration, others with pity, but Maeve's feelings were more complicated, a tangle of curiosity, empathy, and something unspoken that she had tucked away deep in her chest. A cool wind tugged at her scarf as she approached the manor gates, the iron cold beneath her fingertips. She paused for a moment, drawing a deep breath, and let her gaze drift over the house. It looked much as it always had, solid, a little lonely, yet inviting in its way. The garden, though untended, was ablaze with the wild beauty of late spring, tangled roses, nodding foxgloves, and the blue haze of forget-me-nots carpeting the lawn. Maeve stepped through the side entrance, careful not to disturb the hush that filled the house. Her footsteps echoed softly in the tiled corridor, mingling with the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. She set down her basket in the kitchen, the bread's warmth lingering in her palms, and began her morning tasks with practiced ease, opening shutters, drawing water, dusting the mantel. Each small act was a kind of prayer, a way of weaving comfort into the very fabric of the house. Olá, linda alma romântica! Antes de começarmos nossa história de hoje, convido você a se inscrever e curtir para que possamos continuar compartilhando essas histórias emocionantes juntos. E me diga nos comentários, de que canto do mundo você está ouvindo esta noite? In the upstairs corridor, Alistair moved quietly through the rooms, trailing his fingertips along the faded wallpaper. He paused by a closed door, the nursery untouched since his departure. The memories pressed in, soft and sharp all at once, laughter echoing off the walls, the weight of a small hand in his own, promises whispered in the dark. He turned away, the ache in his chest both familiar and fresh, and made his way downstairs. He was not expecting to meet anyone in the hall, and so when he rounded the corner and saw Maeve, he halted, surprise flickering across his features. She, too, paused, her hands wrapped around a teacup, her eyes wide and luminous in the morning light. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to contract to the narrow space between them, charged with an energy neither could name. Alistair recovered first, his expression smoothing into the polite detachment that had become his armor. "Good morning, Miss Callahan," he said, his voice low, edged with a formality that felt oddly out of place in the intimacy of the quiet house. Maeve dipped her head, a small smile curving her lips. "Good morning, Mr. Wren, She hesitated, the words catching in her throat, then pressed on. "I hope you slept well." He nodded, though the truth was he had slept poorly, dreams haunted by fragments of the past and the unfamiliarity of his own bed. "As well as can be expected," he replied, his gaze studying her with a searching gentleness. There was something in her manner, an openness, a steadiness that unsettled him, though he could not have said why. A silence stretched between them, filled with the soft ticking of the clock, the distant caw of a rook outside. Maeve shifted her weight, her fingers tightening around the cup. She wondered if he could sense her tension, the way her heart fluttered. Hope and unease twined together like the wild roses in the garden. At last Alistair spoke, his tone gentler. "You have kept the house well. I had forgotten how peaceful it could be here." Maeve's smile deepened, warmth flickering in her eyes. "It's changed little, sir, though perhaps it is a bit quieter now." He looked away, a shadow passing over his face. "Yes," he murmured, "quieter." She longed to say something more, to bridge the distance with a kindness, a memory, a joke, but the words felt too fragile, too easily broken. Instead, she offered what she could. "Would you care for some tea? The kitchen's warm and the bread is fresh from the market." Alistair hesitated, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. He had grown accustomed to solitude, to the quiet company of his own thoughts. Yet something in Maeve's invitation, her quiet certainty, her gentle presence, drew him despite himself. He inclined his head, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Thank you, that would be welcome." They moved through the hall in companionable silence, the air between them weighted with possibility. In the kitchen, sunlight streamed through the window, catching in the motes of flour that drifted in the air. Maeve set about preparing the tea, her movements deft and unhurried, while Alistair settled at the worn wooden table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. He watched her, noticing the way she hummed softly under her breath, the way the morning light gilded the curve of her cheek. There was a grace in her, quiet and unassuming, that reminded him of the sea at dawn, steady, enduring, and full of hidden depths. He realized with a start that he wanted to know those depths, to understand the currents that moved beneath her calm surface. Maeve poured the tea, her hands steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. She slid the cup across the table, her gaze meeting his for a brief electric moment. "Here you are, sir." Alistair accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest instant, a touch so light it might have been imagined, yet it sent a ripple through them both. He cleared his throat, searching for something to say, something to anchor them in this new, uncertain territory. "You must have seen many changes here in my absence," he ventured, his voice tentative. Maeve nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Some things change, others stay the same. The sea, for instance, it's always there, always moving, yet never quite the same from one day to the next." He smiled, a genuine warmth flickering behind his reserve. "Much like people, I suppose." She laughed, a soft sound that seemed to lighten the room. "Yes, I think so." For a moment, the barriers between them seemed to thin. They sat in the golden quiet, sipping tea, sharing small stories. The weather, the antics of the village children, the stubbornness of the manor's ancient plumbing. Each word, each glance, was a step along a fragile bridge, built not of grand gestures, but of small everyday kindnesses. Outside, the day brightened, the wind carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed stone. Inside, two souls long accustomed to solitude found themselves drawn together by the quiet magic of shared space and the promise of something yet unspoken. And though neither could have named the feeling, both sensed that in this gentle beginning lay the seeds of something extraordinary, a hope as persistent and delicate as the wildflowers blooming on the cliffs above the restless sea. As days slid quietly past, the manor on the cliff seemed to breathe anew, as if the gentle exchanges between Alistair and Maeve had coaxed a forgotten warmth from its ancient stones. The morning routines took on a different cadence now. Maeve moved through the halls with a purposeful grace, her footsteps lightly echoing along the wood-panelled corridors, the subtle swish of her skirts brushing against faded rugs. Alistair, once content to lose himself in brooding silence, found his gaze lingering on the doorway she passed through, waiting for the faintest glimpse of her as she went about her tasks. Outside, the village below stirred with the steady rhythms of coastal life. Fishermen called to one another as they hauled in their nets, their voices carrying up to the manor with the cries of gulls. The air was always tinged with the mingled scents of brine and wildflowers, and on certain afternoons, the breeze would carry the distant laughter of children playing near the quay. It was a world that Maeve knew intimately, yet now she saw it with different eyes, colored by the knowledge that just above, a life was quietly entwining with hers in ways she had never expected. Olá, linda alma romântica. Antes de começarmos nossa história de hoje, convido você a se inscrever e curtir, para que possamos continuar compartilhando essas histórias emocionantes juntos. E me diga nos comentários, de que canto do mundo você está ouvindo esta noite? It was on a rain-swept Thursday that the first true fissure appeared in the delicate peace between them. The morning dawned grey and sullen, clouds hanging low as if the sky itself pressed down on the earth. Maeve had risen early, her hands cold as she folded linens in the scullery, the rhythm of her work soothing and familiar. Yet her mind wandered. She thought of the night before when Alistair had lingered over his supper, his eyes distant, his words trailing off before he could finish a thought. There was a heaviness about him, a weight that no amount of gentle conversation had managed to lift. She found him later in the library, standing by the tall windows, his silhouette outlined against the stormy sea. Books lay scattered on the table beside him, but it was clear he hadn't been reading. Maeve hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether to disturb him, but something in the rigid set of his shoulders urged her forward. "Sir," she ventured softly, her voice barely rising above the patter of rain against glass. "Would you care for tea?" Alistair turned, startled out of reverie. For a moment he searched her face as if looking for something he'd lost. "Thank you, Maeve," he murmured, the words carrying a quiet gratitude. "That would be welcome." She moved to prepare the tea, her movements practiced and efficient, yet her hands trembled just enough for her to notice. When she returned with the tray, Alistair had retreated into one of the high-backed chairs, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She set the cup carefully before him, the china clinking softly against the saucer. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she asked, trying to mask the concern in her tone. He shook his head, but after a pause he spoke, his voice low, almost confessional. "There are days when I wonder if I brought anything of worth back with me, if all I carried home were shadows." The rain intensified, streaking the windows with silver threads. Maeve stood quietly, unwilling to intrude, yet unwilling to leave him alone with his grief. She understood, in her own way, what it meant to feel invisible, to question one's place in the world. After a moment she spoke, her words tentative but sincere. "My mother used to say that even shadows prove there is light somewhere," she offered, eyes downcast. "Sometimes it just takes time to find it again." The silence that followed was thick with meaning. Alistair looked at her, truly looked, as if seeing her for the first time. Not merely as the maid who kept his house in order, but as a person with her own quiet wisdom. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a plea for understanding that stirred something deep within her chest. After that morning, a subtle shift took place. Their conversations grew longer, the words flowing more easily, though always tinged with an undercurrent of caution. Alistair began to share fragments of his travels, stories of distant cities and sun-baked roads, of nights spent beneath foreign stars. His voice would soften when he spoke of his late brother, the ache of loss palpable in the way he traced patterns on the armrest with restless fingers. Maeve listened with quiet attention, never pressing, only offering the comfort of her presence. In return, she found herself revealing small pieces of her own story, the childhood spent in the shadow of the manor, the father lost to the sea, the dreams she'd tucked away like letters in a drawer. She spoke of the urge to see more of the world, though she'd never dared to leave. Alistair, hearing this, would sometimes smile, a fleeting thing that seemed to lift some of the heaviness from his features. Yet, for all the warmth growing between them, there remained boundaries neither dared cross. The simple realities of their lives, her uniform, his title, hung in the air like an unspoken warning. Maeve felt it keenly, especially when she caught the disapproving glances of Mrs. Hallow, the housekeeper, or heard the whispers that drifted up from the village. It was a small town, after all, and stories travelled fast. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Maeve returned from the village market, her basket heavy with fresh bread and root vegetables. She paused at the gate, watching as Alistair walked along the cliff's edge, his coat billowing in the cool breeze. There was something solitary in his stance, a man both part of the landscape and apart from it. She hesitated, then called out softly. "Beautiful evening, sir," she said, the words catching on the wind. Alistair turned, his expression thoughtful. He waited for her to join him, and together they watched the sun sink toward the sea, the silence between them gentle, companionable. "Do you ever wish you could leave this place?" he asked after a time, his voice barely more than a whisper. Maeve considered, the salt air stinging her cheeks. "Sometimes, but I think a part of me will always belong here. It's home even when it's lonely." He nodded as if this simple truth resonated deeply. "I used to believe leaving was the only way to become someone different. Now I wonder if coming back is the only way to remember who I am." Their eyes met, and in that moment the distance between them seemed to shrink, the invisible lines of class and circumstance blurring at the edges. Yet, as quickly as it came, the moment passed. Alistair cleared his throat, retreating behind the polite reserve that had become his shield. Days later, the fragile peace they'd built was shattered by a careless whisper. Maeve was scrubbing the kitchen floor when she overheard Mrs. Hallow speaking with one of the gardeners near the open window. "It's not proper, the way she lingers in the library," the housekeeper muttered. "The master's been through enough. He needs order, not distractions." Maeve's cheeks burned as she ducked her head, the words stinging more than she cared to admit. She finished her chores in silence that day, her movements mechanical, her heart heavy. That evening, when Alistair summoned her to discuss the week's provisions, she kept her answers brief, her gaze fixed on the floor. He noticed, of course. She saw the confusion flicker in his eyes, the way his hand hovered as if to reach out, then fell to his side instead. In the days that followed, a chill settled between them. Alistair, unsure of the source of her withdrawal, became more distant, his words clipped and formal. Maeve retreated into herself, her smiles forced, her laughter absent. The manor seemed to feel it too, the rooms colder, the air heavy with unspoken tension. One evening, as another storm battered the coast, Alistair found himself unable to sleep. He paced the length of the dim hallway, the thunder outside matching the turmoil within his chest. He paused outside the servants' quarters, listening to the muted sounds of life beyond the door, a quiet cough, the rustle of blankets. He considered knocking, then thought better of it, the weight of propriety anchoring his feet in place. Meanwhile, Maeve lay awake, staring at the low ceiling, her thoughts churning like the sea below. She replayed every moment, every conversation, searching for the point where hope had tipped into heartache. She wondered if she had imagined the tenderness in his eyes, the warmth in his voice. Perhaps she had only seen what she wished for, nothing more. The storm raged through the night, lashing rain against the windows, wind howling in the chimneys. It was as if the world itself was mourning with them, washing away the fragile comfort they had found. When morning came, grey and cold, Maeve rose before dawn, determined to keep her distance, to protect what remained of her pride. Alistair too woke early, his face drawn, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He wandered the empty halls, each room echoing with memories, his brother's laughter, his mother's gentle admonishments, the sound of his own voice, younger and unburdened. He paused in the library, running his fingers along the spines of well-worn books, searching for solace in their familiar presence. It was there, in that room heavy with ghosts, that he realized how deeply he missed her. Not the maid, but Maeve, the woman who had listened without judgment, who had brought light into the darkest corners of his life. The ache in his chest was sharp, unexpected. For so long he had believed himself unworthy of connection, convinced that loss was his only inheritance. Now faced with the possibility of losing her as well, he felt something stubborn and hopeful stir within him. He found her later that day in the garden, her hands buried in the dark, damp soil as she tended the small patch of wildflowers that clung bravely to the edge of the cliff. She did not look up as he approached, her shoulders tense, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "Maeve," he said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of all he could not express. She stilled, her fingers curling around the fragile stems of a bluebell. For a moment, neither spoke, the air thick with uncertainty. "I'm sorry," Alistair began, his voice rough with emotion. "I have let too many ghosts dictate my life. I've let fear build walls where there should be doors." Maeve blinked back tears, her voice trembling. "I never meant to be a distraction. If I have overstepped—" "No," he interrupted, a desperate edge to his words. "You have never overstepped. If anything, you have reminded me what it is to feel alive again." The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Maeve looked up at last, her eyes shining with uncertainty, hope flickering like a candle. For the first time, Alistair allowed himself to reach for her, not with grand declarations, but with a simple, honest truth. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted, "but I would like to find out." "With you?" Maeve's answering smile was small, tentative, but it was enough, a fragile thread, golden and unbreakable, weaving them together in the uncertain light of a world washed clean by storm. The wind, cleansed by the storm's passing, softened into a gentle breeze that combed through the grass at their feet. The world around Alistair and Maeve seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth recognized the fragile peace settling between them. For a long moment, neither moved, the tension of the previous days lingering between them, like the remnants of thunder in the air. Then Maeve, her voice barely more than a whisper, broke the silence. "I suppose," she said, her hands twisting together, "we'll both have to learn how to begin again." Alistair's lips curved into the shadow of a smile, the lines at the corners of his eyes softening. "Perhaps beginning is simpler when it's shared," he replied, his gaze steady, though uncertainty flickered beneath the surface. They walked back toward the manor in silence, the only sounds the distant hush of receding waves and the drip of rainwater from the eaves. The old house, battered but steadfast, glowed with a quiet warmth under the pale morning sun. Inside, it felt subtly changed, less hollow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled a long-held breath. Maeve excused herself to the kitchen, her footsteps almost soundless on the worn boards. She busied herself with small tasks, preparing tea, patting the family dog, brushing droplets of rain from her skirts. Through the window, she caught glimpses of Alistair pacing in the garden, his posture thoughtful, the weight on his shoulders not quite as heavy as before. She pressed her hand to the glass, feeling the coolness seep into her skin, and allowed herself a moment of hope. The day unfolded with quiet purpose. There was much to be done, linens to be aired, candles to be trimmed, and the scent of fresh bread to fill the hallways. Yet Maeve moved through her duties with a new kind of ease, her senses alive to every sound and texture, the crackle of the fire, the softness of flour dust on her fingertips, the faint, briny tang in the air that seemed to drift in from the sea. She hummed a tune her mother used to sing, letting the melody anchor her to memories both painful and sweet. Later, as the afternoon light angled golden through the windows, Alistair found her in the library, dusting the spines of old books. He lingered in the doorway, watching the way her hair caught the sun, how her hands moved with practiced care. When she turned and saw him, surprise flickered in her eyes, followed by something softer. "Is there something you need, sir?" she asked, her tone formal but not unfriendly. Alistair hesitated, searching for words that would not betray the tumult of his emotions. No, not need exactly. He stepped into the room, the familiar scent of leather and parchment wrapping around him. "I wanted to thank you. For yesterday. For everything." Maeve's cheeks colored. She looked down, tracing a finger along the edge of a book. "I only did what anyone would have done." He shook his head gently. "Not anyone. Not everyone would have stayed or listened." She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. There was a question there, unspoken, hovering between them. Alistair found himself wishing he could answer it, could promise her safety or certainty, but all he could offer was honesty. "I lost myself for a long time," he said quietly, "after my brother died. The world felt narrower, as if every door had closed." His voice trembled, but he pressed on. "When I returned, I thought I could simply pick up the pieces, but the pieces were not the same. I was not the same." Maeve listened, her expression open, the silence between them charged with meaning. She knew something of loss. Her own father had left for sea one spring and never returned. She carried that ache like a stone in her pocket, always present, sometimes forgotten, always heavy. "I think," she said, choosing her words with care, "when we lose someone, we lose our reflection in their eyes. It takes time to find yourself again." Alistair's breath caught. He nodded, the tension in his frame easing as her words settled around him, gentle and true. For the first time, he allowed himself to see Maeve not just as a fixture in his home, but as a companion in sorrow, a kindred spirit whose strength had carried her through storms of her own. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Temple, the housekeeper, who bustled in with a flurry of activity and a pointed glance. Maeve stepped back, resuming her work, and Alistair retreated, but something had shifted, a quiet understanding, a shared vulnerability that lingered in the air long after they had parted. The days that followed were threaded with a new rhythm. Maeve found herself anticipating Alistair's presence, the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, the way his laughter, though rare, seemed to fill the house with color. She noticed how he would pause by the window at dusk, watching the sea with a faraway look, and sometimes she lingered in the doorway, wishing she were brave enough to join him. Alistair, in turn, grew attuned to Maeve's quiet resilience. He admired the way she tackled her tasks, the gentle authority with which she soothed frightened animals or comforted ailing staff. He caught himself seeking her out, finding excuses to linger in her company, a question about the garden, a request for her opinion on a new painting. Each interaction was small, almost insignificant, yet together they formed the tapestry of a deepening bond. One evening, as the sky blushed pink and the first stars appeared, Alistair invited Maeve to walk with him along the cliff path. She hesitated, aware of the impropriety, but the warmth in his voice dispelled her doubts. They walked in companionable silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the distant cry of gulls. The world felt suspended, the air tinged with salt and promise. Alistair spoke of his travels, of distant cities and sunlit marketplaces, of the people he had met and the loneliness that had dogged his heels. Maeve shared stories of her childhood, of wildflower meadows and stolen moments of joy, of the ache of missing her father, and the comfort she found in familiar rituals. With each confession, the distance between them shrank, replaced by a tender recognition. They walked until the sky darkened, then returned to the manor, their hearts lighter for having unburdened themselves. Yet, as the days grew longer and the village prepared for the midsummer festival, an old unease crept in. Rumors, like sea mist, drifted through the town. whispers about the closeness between master and maid, about impropriety and ambitions. Maeve heard them in the market, felt the weight of curious glances, and her cheeks burned with shame and anger. One morning, as she arranged fresh flowers in the drawing room, Mrs. Temple approached, her expression grave. "People are talking, Maeve. It would be wise to keep your distance for your own sake and his." Maeve nodded, her throat tight. She understood the dangers, how quickly affection could curdle into scandal, how easily kindness could be misinterpreted. She resolved to pull back, to guard her heart, even as it ached to remain open. Alistair noticed the change at once. The way Maeve's smiles were more reserved, her presence more fleeting. He missed her laughter in the kitchen, the comfort of her quiet company. When he asked after her, she replied with polite distance, her eyes shuttered. The tension twisted within him, sharp and insistent. He wondered if he had been selfish, if his longing for connection had placed Maeve in harm's way. Guilt gnawed at him, and he withdrew, immersing himself in work, letting the walls close in once more. The festival arrived, bright with lanterns and music, but the mood in the manor was subdued. Alistair watched from his study window as villagers danced on the green, their joy a distant echo. Maeve, given leave for the evening, wandered the edge of the festivities, her heart heavy, her mind caught between longing and fear. As dusk settled, a sudden shower sent revelers scurrying for cover. Maeve found herself beneath the awning of a deserted stall, the rain drumming a lonely rhythm overhead. She shivered, arms wrapped around herself, eyes stinging with unshed tears. It was there, in the half-light, that Alistair found her. He had left the manor on impulse, drawn by a restlessness he could not name, and when he saw her silhouette against the glow of lanterns, something in him broke free. He approached, his footsteps muffled by the wet grass. "Maeve," he called softly, uncertain whether she would turn. She did, surprise and wariness mingling in her expression. For a long moment, neither spoke, the rain weaving a curtain between them and the rest of the world. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "People are watching." "Let them watch," Alistair replied, his tone fierce and low. "Let them say what they will, I cannot—" He stopped, struggling for breath, for words that would not come. Maeve's defiance flickered, then faded. "It isn't that simple." "No," he agreed, his eyes searching hers. "It isn't. But nothing worth having ever is." A silence fell, heavy with all that was unspoken. Around them, the world shrank to the small circle of light beneath the awning, the rain a soft cocoon. Alistair reached out, hesitating, then gently took Maeve's hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her gaze dropping. "Afraid of hope. Afraid of loss." He squeezed her hand, his own fears reflected in her words. "So am I, but I am more afraid of never knowing what might have been." For a moment neither moved. Then quietly, Maeve leaned against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. The storm passed, leaving behind the scent of rain and the hush of new beginnings. Together, they stood beneath the lantern glow, hearts beating in time, daring, at last, to hope. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted. The rumors persisted, but Maeve and Alistair moved through them as if protected by an invisible shield. They spoke little of the future, but in their shared glances and gentle touches, promises were made. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in amber, Alistair found Maeve in the garden, tending a bed of newly planted roses. He knelt beside her, hands in the earth, and together they worked in companionable silence. When at last they stood, dusted with soil and bathed in golden light, Alistair brushed a stray curl from Maeve's cheek. "I don't know what lies ahead," he said, his voice steady, "but I want to face it with you." Maeve smiled, shy but sure. "Then let's begin." And in that quiet, sun-drenched moment, the promise of tomorrow felt as real and as hopeful as the first bloom of spring. The days that followed unfolded softly, as though the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come for Alistair and Maeve. The manor, once so hollow and echoing with loneliness, began to fill with small, almost imperceptible changes. A vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, the aroma of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen, the sound of laughter, gentle and uncertain at first, echoing down the once somber corridors. The coastal air carried a new kind of promise, crisp and bright, mingling with the salt and earth and blooming heather. They settled into a gentle rhythm, their lives entwining in ways both ordinary and profound. Mornings found them in the garden, hands touching earth, planting seeds side by side. Alistair, whose hands had once known only ink and paper, learned the patience of tending to living things. Maeve, who had spent so many years in service to others, felt seen and valued for the first time. Sometimes, as the sun crept over the horizon, Maeve would pause and watch Alistair, noticing the quiet determination in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. In those moments, she felt an ache in her chest, something tender and fragile and impossibly hopeful. The village too began to take notice. Whispers drifted on the breeze, curious, sometimes skeptical, but Maeve and Alistair moved through the world as if they were creating a space all their own, shielded by the quiet certainty that was blossoming between them. Yet, not all doubts melted away so easily. There were nights when Alistair would retreat into silence, his gaze distant, haunted by memories he could not yet share. And Maeve, for all her newfound confidence, sometimes wondered if the happiness she felt could last, or if it would slip away like morning mist. One evening, a heavy fog rolled in from the sea, muffling the world in grey and silver. Alistair sat by the fire in the study, a forgotten book open in his lap, the flames casting restless shadows on the walls. Maeve entered quietly, her arms wrapped around herself, and settled in the chair opposite him. The hush between them was gentle, filled with the crackle of logs and the distant call of a night bird. Alistair looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of speaking, but the words faltered, caught somewhere between fear and longing. Maeve broke the silence first, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you ever wonder if we belong here?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the shifting embers. "Or if this is just a dream?" Alistair's brow furrowed, and he closed the book on his knee. "Every day," he admitted, the corners of his mouth curving in a rueful smile. "I wonder if I deserve any of it. If I can truly begin again." The confession hung between them, heavy and vulnerable. She studied him for a long moment, then reached across the space between their chairs, her fingers grazing his. "You do," she said, steady and sure. "We both do. Maybe that's why we found each other here at the edge of everything." He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. It was not a promise of forever, nor a denial of the difficulties still to come. It was an acknowledgement of the truth, that love is not a cure, but a balm, not a certainty, but a choice made, again and again, in the quiet moments when hope is all that remains. After a while, the fog outside began to lift, and the distant light of the moon silvered the garden paths. Alistair stood and held out his hand. "Come," he invited softly, "let's walk." They stepped out into the cool night, the dew-laden grass brushing their ankles. The manor stood behind them, its windows glowing with warm light, while the sea murmured softly in the darkness. As they wandered the winding paths, Maeve slipped her hand into Alistair's, their fingers interlacing with an ease that felt both new and inevitable. "I used to walk here as a child," Maeve murmured, her breath clouding in the chill air. "I'd imagined the world was much larger than this village, full of places I'd never seen, things I'd never done. But lately I think, perhaps happiness isn't found in distant cities, but in moments like this." Alistair squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing circles against her skin. "I spent so long searching for meaning elsewhere," he admitted, his voice low, "but I was only ever running from myself, from my regrets, and from the people I lost. Coming home felt impossible, until you reminded me that there was still something left to hope for." Maeve stopped, turning to face him. The moonlight illuminated her features, a delicate mosaic of strength and vulnerability. "So you brought me hope too, Alistair, more than you know." A silence stretched between them, full and luminous. In the stillness, every doubt, every fear seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet certainty of their connection. Alistair reached up, cupping Maeve's cheek in his palm. She leaned into his touch, eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm afraid," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of losing this. of failing you, or myself?" Maeve's lips curved in a gentle smile, her hand covering his. "I am too. But I think sometimes you have to risk your heart. Even if it hurts. Even if you don't know what comes next." He drew her close, and for a moment their foreheads touched, breath mingling in the cool night air. The world seemed to pause, as if giving them permission to simply exist in this fragile, perfect moment. When their lips finally met, it was not with the urgency of longing, but with the slow, reverent certainty of two souls finding solace in each other. The kiss was gentle, soft as the petals of the roses they had planted together, warm as the morning sun on dew-damp grass. It was a promise, unspoken yet deeply understood. Whatever storms might come, whatever shadows might linger, they would face them together. In the days that followed, life continued its steady, measured pace. There were still chores to be done, letters to write, meals to prepare. The villagers' whispers faded into a quiet acceptance, their curiosity giving way to a kind of respect. Children who once hurried past the manor gates now lingered, waving shyly at Maeve as she swept the steps or tended the flower beds. Alistair too found himself drawn back into the fabric of the village, offering advice to farmers, lending a hand at the small schoolhouse, sharing stories of distant lands with wide-eyed youngsters. Yet beneath the surface of these ordinary days, something extraordinary was quietly unfolding. Maeve and Alistair, once strangers bound by circumstance, became partners in every sense, sharing burdens, dreams, and the quiet joys of companionship. Their differences, once sources of insecurity, became the threads that wove them closer. Maeve's resilience softened Alistair's pride. His gentleness eased the loneliness she had carried for so long. There were moments of doubt, as all lovers know. Late at night, when the wind howled around the eaves and the sea crashed against the cliffs, Maeve would sometimes lie awake, tracing patterns on the ceiling with her thoughts. She wondered if happiness could last, if the world would allow two people from such different lives to truly belong together. In those moments, Alistair would sense her restlessness, reaching for her hand in the darkness, grounding her with a touch, a whispered reassurance. For Alistair, the journey was one of forgiveness, of himself, of the choices he had made, of the years lost to grief and pride. He learned to find joy in small victories, a rose blooming in winter, the laughter of children on the lawn, Maeve's smile as she read by the window. Each day, he chose to open his heart a little more, to let go of the past and embrace the present. One morning, as the first signs of spring shimmered in the hedgerows, Alistair and Maeve stood together at the cliff's edge, watching the sun rise over the restless sea. The air was alive with birdsong, the promise of new beginnings woven into every ray of light. Maeve slipped her arm around Alistair's waist, leaning into his warmth. "Do you think," she asked quietly, "that we'll always have this, even when the world changes?" He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice steady and sure. "I can't promise what the world will bring, but I can promise this. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. You are the meaning I thought I'd lost. With you, I am home." A soft breeze stirred the wildflowers at their feet, carrying the scent of sea and earth and the faintest trace of hope. Alistair and Maeve stood in silence, their hearts beating in time with the waves below, a quiet, steady rhythm that spoke of healing, of courage, of love found and cherished. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden paths across the water, they turned back toward the manor hand in hand. The future stretched before them. Uncertain, yes, but filled with possibility. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and days when the weight of the world pressed heavy on their shoulders. But there would also be laughter and shared dreams, and the comfort of knowing that whatever else might change, they would have each other. And so, in a house once haunted by absence, warmth and light returned. In a village once ruled by whispers, acceptance blossomed. Alistair and Maeve, united by the improbable alchemy of hope and healing, walked forward, together, into whatever tomorrow might bring. May those who listen to their story tonight find a quiet place in their own hearts for hope to bloom, and may the gentle promise of new beginnings carry them softly into dreams.